We looked at this passage a little bit this morning in our lesson. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man or woman is powerful and effective. But long before James ever wrote this, we can see a real-life example of this passage being lived out in 1 Samuel. We've been studying through 1 Samuel during our afternoon time together, and in our study we have seen the effective and fervent prayer of Hanna at the beginning of the book. Now, for one thing, Hanna, not only did she pray, but what else did she do that many times today we don't do? She fasted. Anybody ever committed to a fast and gone through with a fast? I've done a couple of times, not very many, but a few times. But back then, fasting was about as serious as prayer was. And if you notice in 1 Samuel chapter 1, notice verse 11. She wanted a son, and she prayed for a son. To please, Lord, give your servant a son. Then, if you look at verse 10, she prayed unto the Lord and wept. Wept a lot, wept heavily, wept sore, depending on what your translation says. And then we see from verse 7 that she fasted. She did both of those, and really put a lot of emphasis into her prayer for this son that she wanted. Now, we all probably can point to times in our lives when God answered a prayer for us by healing somebody or somebody that we know. I was reading about a college in 1985. It was Liberty Mountain, and I'm not sure where that is, but it's Liberty Mountain College. In April of 1985, about 5,000 students fasted and prayed for one day for their dean of students. And he was very popular, much loved by the students, but he had cancer and wasn't expected to live very long. And he lived at least another 12 years after that. I don't know, it's been 30 years now. I don't know if he's still alive or not, but would you think that prayer had something to do with that? Well, I do. And Hanna now is someone who has come to a time of prayer, a time where she is really wanting to have a son, and she's going to be our example of prayer. Now, of course, we have to stop and think, because I'm praying for a child or a son or a particular thing, I'm not always going to get a yes answer. We looked at that this morning. Sometimes it'll be no, or sometimes God will answer the prayer with what we want, but you have to sometimes, look for the entrance to come in the back door, not the front door. He may not answer it exactly in the manner that we are expecting. And look at how Hanna faced her issues with prayer. Now remember, she's got a rival in all this, and that is her husband's other wife. But she faced her problems with real faith. She faced her problems by praying for a son. Now, there was some research I read about a study in Finland that said boys tended to shorten the lives of their mothers. Now, if she'd have known that, she might have prayed for a daughter instead of a son. But Finland wasn't around then as a country. So anyway, she probably didn't know about that. But she wasn't going to be dissuaded from her prayer time. She was going to pray and take this to the Lord, and she received some persecution, of course, from her husband's other wife. Well, she's praying for the son, because remember, Pennen, whatever her name was really laying it on thick that I've got children, you don't. I've got sons, you don't. And she ridiculed her. And when you look at this situation, I really wonder how anyone can look at this situation and defend polygamy. You ever thought about that? Think of all the hassles you would get from multiple wives, multiple children. How can you show proper affection when you've got 2 or 3 or 4 wives? And there are sects of Mormonism still out there in Utah, Arizona. I think there's even some in Colorado that still think that polygamy is the way to go. What they don't realize is when Joseph Smith had that revelation, and I use the term loosely, he was actually caught by his wife in an affair, and that's where the whole thing came from. But another matter for another discussion another time. But just think about that. Sibling rivalry exists in a lot of sibling relationships. Imagine it here where you've got one father, but 3 to 4 or 5 or however many different mothers. And you can see here where this is a good example of how it doesn't work. Why the original plan of one man, one wife is what God intended, and that is the best plan. But her lesson for all of us is to pray decisively. If God has put something on your heart to do, then pray about it and go for it. If there's a situation that needs special attention. See, Hannah was convinced that God was capable of opening her womb and providing a child for her, and we know eventually he did do just that because she prayed vibrantly. Vibrantly. She put everything she had. Look at verses 9 through 18. Now we can see that she had some problems, but she did not let those problems get the best of her. Chapter 1, you notice beginning in verse 9, that Hanna arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was on the seat of the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affection of your maidservant, or rather the affliction of your maidservant, and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. And it happened as she continued to pray before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, only with her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli assumed she was drunk. I mean, that's how bad things had gotten there. Things were so bad, people apparently were showing up to the temple drunk, and here, or rather to the tabernacle drunk. And here he tells her, hey, how long are you going to be drunk? Hey, lady, look, I don't need you to be around here if you're going to be that drunk. Why don't you just come back when you're sober? But Hannah answered and said, no, my lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. She is being very vibrant in her prayers. And then notice that she's going and showing her faith in her prayers. If you really have faith in God, then let's take it to him. Remember that in our daily relationships, don't we typically ask favors or ask for people to do things for us that we rely on? How many of us have a job because we're relied upon? We're relied upon to be there at a certain time. We're relied upon to do certain things. So if I call you and say, hey, on your way over, would you stop at the store and pick up some milk and eggs for me? I'm relying on you to do that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have asked you. And God will use sometimes situations in our lives to get attention. Y'all watch NCIS, one of our shows, the old give slap on the back of the head. Sometimes that's God's way of giving us a give slap. It's by situations like Hannah had to face, where she is wanting a child. She's really praying for it. Psalm 119 in verse 71, he says, it is good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. It's that's why God sometimes blesses us with good times, and then we have hard times. The hard times make us appreciate the good times. See, I happen to be one who, all know I grew up in Alaska and lived in Canada and in Colorado and Indiana. It's a trick question, but you might want to guess what's my least favorite time of the year. It's winter. I hate the cold. But in December, January, and February, when it's cold and we have the extended darkness, it helps me to appreciate the warmth and the long days better. And without that, I probably wouldn't appreciate them very much. And so sometimes that's the way it is with God. We get afflicted, we have problems, but it can help us to appreciate good times better. Problems should drive us to prayer. But how many of us get detoured when we're going to prayer? And then as part of her prayer, you notice she's made a vow to give her son to be dedicated to the Lord, and this is something you have to keep in mind. You cannot make promises to God flippantly. I have had people make promises to me. They'll show up at a certain time for Bible study and then stand me up. And even in the insurance business, I get that. But you can't do that with God. If you make a vow to God, you better keep it, or don't even make it. And she's made that vow. She is going to have her son dedicated for the rest of his life. Remember, children are not just for the parents, but they are for the Lord. I really hope one day Amelia does become a Christian. I want her to grow up right. I want her to grow up looking for a Christian husband and to raise her children up properly. And, I'm like any other parent, learning as I go. We'll make mistakes along the way, but the ultimate end game needs to be to raise Christian children. She kept on praying to the Lord. This wasn't just a quick canned prayer, but she was making repeated requests. Now, how many of us will, when we get up to lead a prayer, we just say whatever words and phrases we learned from people who learn words and phrases from people who they learn words and phrases from. How many of us kind of say the same thing over and over again? Not only do we get repetitive, we get redundant as well in our prayers. But use not just canned prayers and phrases, but be earnest and honest with God, and maybe even like her. Go to tears. She was crying tears of sorrow, really pleading with God. And we can do that just as well as she did. And then after spending time in prayer with the Lord, her face wasn't sad anymore. She eventually figured out, okay, God's going to work this out. And we have to, now in her case, she did get a child. She got a yes answer. We have to remember that God isn't always going to give us a yes. No is every bit of an answer as yes is. It could be wait a while. There's any number of ways God can answer prayer. We just have to be prepared for that answer, whatever that answer is. And notice that she went away her way and ate something, and her countenance changed. Her face was no longer downcast. That is the power of prayer. She had left her concerns with the Lord. There used to be a song that I heard on the radio years ago where it said, take your problems to the altar and leave them there. God still cares. He still answers prayers. And that's the idea, is take it to the Lord, leave it there, let the Lord deal with it. Just like when the boss maybe gives you an assignment, he walks away, leaves it with you. It's up to you now to make sure it gets done. And that's what the Lord is. Leave it with him. He'll take care of it. Someone once said, obey God, leave the consequences to him. Take it to God in prayer, leave it to him, and then let him deal with it. And then prayer will lead us to experiencing God's provisions. Look at verses 19 and 20. On the next morning, they worshiped before the Lord. That was their practice, and then they headed home to Shiloh. That's kind of like the family that was with us this morning, where they came as part of their family reunion and worshiped with us. Now they're headed home. They did the same thing. They didn't skip on worship. When I travel, I try to avoid traveling on Sundays if I can, but if I have to, I still try to find a place where I can meet with God's people somewhere on the road, or we might have I've had lots of devotionals in hotel rooms or campgrounds or wherever. But make sure when you're traveling, you have some God time when you're traveling. God doesn't take a vacation from us. He doesn't take a long weekend like we might do. He's always there, so let's just return it to him and be there with God's people. Hanna, you notice, conceived and gave birth to a son. Samuel means heard of God. All the names that they would give their kids have some meaning to them. And if a name ends in EL, like Samuel does, it's got something to do with God, with Jehovah. The name does. Israel wrestles with God. Some say Prince of God. But if it ends in an EL and it's a Hebrew word, it's got something to do with God. And then notice, just because, as I've been saying over and over, just because her prayer for a child, for a son, was answered with a yes, doesn't mean all of our prayers are going to be answered with a yes. But we will get an answer to our prayers. And then remember, you will receive God's provisions one way or another. God will still take care of us. Remember, he said, Matthew chapter 7, verse 11, he said, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? You know, no parent is going to deny, a good parent anyway, is going to deny their children what they need. God will not deny us. He will see to it we are taken care of. And then prayer leads to praise. Look at chapter 2. Now, she had a psalm of praise there. How many times has God answered a prayer maybe for someone to get well and we don't say thank you? I had a friend years ago. He'd get up about 5 o'clock just about every morning that I knew him. And the first hour of the day, he'd roll out of bed and go into a quiet place. He'd read the Bible, pray. And a friend of his came to him once and said, would you pray for my mother? She's really sick. He said, be glad to. So he prayed for his mother every day for a solid month. And then he went to his friend and said, oh, how's your mother doing? Well, she's doing great. About 2 weeks after I asked you to pray for her, she was better. She was out of the hospital. She was home. She's back at work. She's fine. And he just kind of rolled his eyes and said, you know, not at his friend, but he just did it as he was telling us the story. He said, for 2 weeks I was praying for this woman to get well, when really for 2 weeks I should have been thanking God for it. So when you ask for prayers, you get results, the ones that you want. Be sure and say thank you. Be sure and let, if you've asked someone to pray for a situation, when you get it, say thank you. This is how it turned out. And just be thankful that God got you an answer for what that prayer was. Notice she was, look at here, verses 1 through 11. She is thrilled. She's going to be the parent of a prophet. And he's going to rise up to do some really great things for God. But in the meantime, she's essentially going to have to give him up, because he's going to have to go with the Lord and live there at the tabernacle with Eli. But she overlooks the gift, and notice, and she gives praise to the giver. She is so thankful to have this child, and she's going to keep her word. She is keeping that vow that she made, that he is going to be dedicated to the Lord, to his service. And she is an example of women of faith and of men of faith. This is the way prayer should work. This is what should drive us to prayer. And one of the lessons we can get is that each of us needs to be growing in our own relationship to God. If you want your kids to learn about God, if you want your neighbors to learn about God, they're not going to do it unless you lead the way. We've all got to do it. And I really want y'all to pray for me and Debbie that we do that right for Amelia, that we are leading her to the Lord into a Christian home, and that she'll one day herself become a Christian and raise a Christian family. So this afternoon, are you on that right path? The path that will lead your friends and your relatives to the Lord. If you're not, then let us help you to get on that path. It's a straight and narrow one. It's not wide like we like to think of interstate highways. It's narrow, and it can take some work to stay on. That's what we're here for, is to help you stay on the path. And if we can help you in any way, let us know as together we stand and as we sing.
Softly and tenderly Jesus is calling.